Hello and welcome to the Everyday Adventure Podcast. My name is Nikki Bass and I will be bringing you thoughts, ideas and stories from some incredible guests to hopefully inspire you to live more adventurously in your everyday lives. So today I'm incredibly excited to welcome Annabel Abbs to the show. Annabel is an award-winning author whose fiction and non-fiction has been translated into over 15 languages. And her latest book, Windswept, Walking in the Footsteps of Remarkable Women, is a part wild walk, part memoir, and it follows both Annabel's own experience of walking and how she's grown up with walking in a way and how it's developed alongside her own life. And it's interwoven with the stories of these 6 remarkable women. And I just thought it was such a really fascinating way of combining that sort of personal experience with the history and adventures of women. And as Annabel herself says, stories who haven't been written before. So really excited to speak to Annabel today. And just before I start, I always have to give a shout out to 2 other remarkable women who are partly responsible for getting me and Annabel together. So Jo Mosley of the Joy of Sup podcast, who very kindly introduced me to Annabel's publisher and started this whole connection. And the lovely Katie Friend of Chatting to a Friend podcast, both of whom have been previous guests on this show. And having listened to Katie's wonderful interview with Annabel, I was even more excited to be able to have the chance to speak to her in person as well and just find a little bit more about what inspired her to write the book and her own experiences of walking too. So Annabel, thank you so much for joining me. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thank you for having me. Well, where to start? I can start with my own childhood, which is probably where the story begins, because my parents couldn't drive. My father never learned to drive. And my mother only learned to drive in her 40s after she took a test about 8 times. So driving just wasn't something that we did. So we had to walk everywhere. Also, we lived in this very remote little Welsh valley with a very limited public transport. So if you wanted anything, you had to walk. And all our friends lived on the tops of hills. So we were always walking up and down hills. And of course, I thought this was really quite normal. So we moved away from Wales. We moved to a perfectly normal town in Sussex. And I realised that actually everyone had at least 1 car, if not 2 cars. And all my friends sort of sat in the back seat of cars and they were driven everywhere. But by then, the damage was done, if you like, or not really the damage. I suppose, I'd become habituated and quite accustomed to walking. So walking for long distances felt very normal. But of course, when I arrived at school, I'd been home educated. I arrived at school and I couldn't do anything. I couldn't throw balls. We'd never had wheels or balls in the house. So I couldn't throw a ball or do anything on a skateboard or a roller skate or anything. And I couldn't swim, I couldn't ride a bicycle. So it was very, very uncoordinated. But the only thing I could do was walk. So later on, fast forward a few years and I came back to walking, and walking really became my thing. I walked and climbed mountains all over the world, really. And then, children come along and it's very hard. I had 4 of them. So it was quite hard to do anything, with 4 of them. Walking really was very difficult. So we didn't really walk very much. And I really started to miss it. I really started to miss not just that whole, walking for hour after hour, which I absolutely love, but also wild spaces. Those great big outdoor landscapes that, we've all really yearned for in lockdown, haven't we? Psychologically, they've sort of taken on this huge significance. We're all trapped in our kitchens all day with all the family. So I started to read. I thought, well, I can't go out walks. I've got all these children and I was working full time, and, you're there in that place. It's really hard, isn't it?
Yeah, completely.
You can't just say, right, I'm off for a 5-day hike, guys.
Tempting as it is, yeah.
Very, very tempting, but it didn't really happen. So I started reading, and it was at that stage I thought all these books are by men, or by men and about men, mostly by men and about men and for men. And I thought, well, did no one else like walking like me? Can't be the only person. And so I started to dig around, and of course, women have always walked. I mean, the idea that, as the lone enraptured male, Byron and Shelley and Wordsworth just sort of heading off into the distance, or even the more contemporary ones, it's a complete myth. I mean, they did walk, but loads of women were walking too. But the women, often they didn't write about it, or often they wrote about it and their stories weren't published. or they wrote about it and their books were published, and they had one print run and then they weren't republished, so they went out of print very quickly. And the thing is, if you read an anthology of walking by a man, he only references other men. And this, I think for a while I hadn't noticed, but then one day I thought, and it really started to get on my nerves. I mean, really, I started to, not quite stalk physically, but I started to stalk all these male writers online because I thought, well, haven't they got wives or children? How can they do this? And of course, they did have wives and children, but they were still just sort of wandering off, 3 weeks in the mountains. And so at that stage, I just thought, right, I've got to write about this because I need to write about all these women that I was uncovering. And I uncovered about 50 women. And I went to an editor, and in fact, lots of people wanted books. I thought, okay, that's good. There's obviously a bit of a market for this. And then the editor I eventually worked with looked at my list of 50 and said, you've got too many, cut it right back. So I cut it back, and I looked at Simone de Beauvoir, who is a very famous French philosopher who is never included in there are quite a lot of books about the Philosopher's Guide to Walking or whatever, and she's never in them.
Wow.
So that made me very cross too.
Mm.
And people like Daphne du Maurier that people didn't ever think of as a walker, just a writer. And then painters like Gwen John and Georgia O'Keeffe, and people they don't think of them as walkers, they just think of them as painters. It's almost as if you're a woman, you can really only do one thing.
Yeah, I was just thinking that actually, that idea. Yes, that's your category.
Your bow, yes, you're a painter, you're a painter.
Yeah.
So at that stage, I started just do lots and lots of research. And I decided the best way to, research this properly was to go and do the walks, some of the walks that they had done, rather than just sit on my backside, in libraries and things. So I set off, I plotted out their trails. And but I was really quite pleased because one of the things that Simone de Beauvoir says in her great tome, The Second Sex, is she says the first stage in a woman's liberation is when she can plot out her own route on her own. Not do it, but just when she can sit with a map and work out a route. And she was really specific. That is the first step in freedom, finding freedom. I thought, oh, that's really cool. So I spent a lot of time with maps, which I loved. And I plotted out the routes, and then off I went. And I sort of wrote about my experience of walking the route today, but I was trying to understand what it was like for them. Because we have to remember, I kept having to remind myself that they went off with no phone, with no waterproof trousers, with no GPS, no mountain rescue service, no bra, no rehydrated packaged food, no lightweight tent, no lightweight backpack, no walking boots because they weren't made for women. They went off often in men's boots, or Simone de Beauvoir walked off in espadrilles. I don't know how she walked 30 miles a day in espadrilles, but she did. And Emma Gatewood in America, she was in her 60s. She walked off it. She wore men's tennis shoes. So there was absolutely none of the kit that you find if you go into an outdoor store now. Amazing clothes for women. And all the kit that you need, especially made, often it's quite, especially made for us, but they didn't have any of that at all. So I kept having to think, okay, their backpack would have been much, much heavier than mine. They would have not have had the comfort of a phone, which I, always had my phone if I felt frightened.
Yeah.
And I tried to do some of the other things that they did. So they would carry watercolors and they would paint and draw because they didn't have cameras. So and they certainly didn't have iPhones with everything on it. So I tried taking paints and paper and doing that, and I tried to turn my phone off as much as I could so that I could experience a little bit of what they had. Didn't quite go braless, but
that would be the most challenging part for me. I'd be like, no, you've lost me now.
But isn't it extraordinary to think that off they went?
I never even thought about that. Yeah. 2 or 3 weeks.
And everything was wool. The socks were wool. The jackets were either wool or waxed, sort of waxed material, but really heavy. And I tried to go and find all this kit just so I can hold it. I didn't wear it, but I went to Germany and held one of the rucksacks that they would have taken. And it was so heavy. It was canvas and leather with solid brass buckles and, the sort of the struts down the back. It was really heavy. So I think my entire rucksack with everything in weighed just what their empty rucksack weighed.
Gosh.
So I was trying really to get into their heads, really, but also into their bodies. So in terms of getting into their heads, I started to work out from the research that none of them went off like a man does. None of them went off for an adventure. Because in those days, it was really, a woman just didn't say, oh, I'm just going off for an adventure. They were really compelled, something was compelling them to go, particularly the earlier ones, and most of whom didn't get into the Victorian women. And they were they were incredibly brave, some of them. And, they were harassed and abused and jeered at all the time, often by, mainly by men, let's be honest, mainly by men, but sometimes by children as well. So they were figures of fun, really. Particularly some of the earlier ones in the 1860s who are walking over the Pyrenees. They don't often have backpacks at all. They go with a little carpet bag or something over their wrist with all their worldly belongings in. So anyway, so all these stories, I found them absolutely fascinating. Looking at what it was that impelled these women to do something that was really quite risky. It's quite. We forget really how dangerous it is to go up into the mountains. We all have mountain rescue now, and we have so many things and shelters and things. They went off with nothing. So they were incredibly brave, and that really spurred me on. And one of the reasons I wanted to get their stories out, because I think there's a line in the book where I talk about how courage is contagious. And as I was thinking about my 3 daughters, I thought, God, if they grow up not as I did, thinking that it was only men out there on the Texan plains or in the Scottish mountains or in the Alps, it was only men, they will always feel that that place is not for them. The wilds are not for them. The wilds are just for, Marlborough Man or, Wordsworth or whoever, the men of history who we've seen. And I really wanted them to see me doing it. And in fact, they're all very brave, they're much braver than me. But the other thing, going back to something we talked about just before the program started, was how once you get a bit older and you've had children, I discovered that I had this new level of fear, and I didn't understand where it had come from. But I suspect it is some sort of biological mechanism, isn't it, to keep myself safe? Because without me, when they're small, all right now, when they're small, they don't survive, do they? So I think it sort of seems to be genetically built into most women. Occasionally you hear about some who manage to escape, who don't feel that same level of fear. But it seems to be genetically built into us to feel this sudden surge of fear. I mean, it literally comes on with the first pregnancy. Looking back, it sort of came on with the first pregnancy, and then it sort of mounted. So with each child, I became more and more fearful. So then, so when the youngest was 7, I said to my husband, we've got to have walking holidays. I don't want any other holiday except a walking holiday. And he loves walking too. So he agreed. And from that point on, we walked with our 4 kids. Every holiday was, over mountains, through mountains, just in extraordinary places. We hiked all over the place. And so they're fairly hardy now. And that was my step back into, because I had to be brave then. And quite often, I suffer from vertigo. That's my other terrible problem. And I've always had that. But the vertigo was much worse, after I'd had children. And I was really determined that my children didn't see me sort of shaking and quaking on every little ledge. And in fact, they did, because I couldn't really, I just did terrible vertigo. But actually, they found it quite funny. I found it quite funny. So the vertigo, it sort of made them feel a bit stronger in a way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. No, I think there's that aspect of, that you're able to be vulnerable and still do something, or still feel fear and find a way around it. And in a way, I think that because children have all of those fears too,
yes,
that often that they feel that they've got to sort of, not show or be brave or be tough or whatever, and actually just being able to go, I'm really scared, and then navigate that together, I think so powerful. And probably, that's probably contributed to their hardiness, like you said.
Yes. I hope. Well, maybe it has. Yeah, none of them have vertigo, so, but I
can relate to the vertigo thing too. So yeah,
it's very common.
And it definitely got worse when I had kids. I was fine before I had children, and then it was So I think that's so interesting, that point about, that where I think partly because you don't do things as much, so there's a sort of practical aspect that your world contracts in terms of what you're physically doing. But I think, like you said, also just that protective aspect of I've got to keep myself safe, so I can't risk in the same way as maybe I did before. And I can absolutely relate to that. And I was just wondering, was there one particular story or one particular woman out of the six, or maybe the stories that didn't get published, that really, I guess, either really surprised you or really sort of resonated with, that you sort of thought, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought of it in that way before, or it was, this is an experience I hadn't expected to come across potentially?
Yeah, quite a few, but I'll probably, I'll tell you who I'll mention. I'll mention Nan Shepherd, the Scottish walker and mountaineer. Have you come across Nan?
I hadn't previously, no. Only, like I said, only through your books. So she just to illustrate your point, really.
She is really extraordinary. So she walked in the Cairngorms in Scotland, and she walked there most of her adult life, really. And then she wrote an extraordinary tiny little book about it, which has only just come back into print, really, but it's extraordinary. And she is all about a sort of embodied walking. So she really showed me how to walk with all my senses. So instead of just sort of powering along, which I have a tendency just to sort of power along, to try and get there. That's probably also a hang up from having children. You just want to get somewhere as fast as possible.
Exactly. Someone needs the loo or something.
That's right. So it's always, you're sort of racing against time. But she really shows, in that book, she talks about how to slow down as you walk. And she is full of techniques, little funny, quirky techniques for seeing the landscape in a different way. For example, she'll bend over and put her head through her legs and then sort of look at the world sort of upside down.
Oh, wow.
And she talks about all the plants that she touches and how she keeps a little bit of dried juniper in her pocket so she keeps smelling it. And she talks about, walking barefoot over the heather, and she talks about sleeping outside. So she really introduced me to a sort of a calmer and a really embodied way of walking, where I was using all of my senses, and it wasn't just about the step count, the getting there, but it was about the listening and the smelling and feeling things through your fingers. And she puts her hands into the soil and into moss, and she describes it so beautifully that she makes you want to do that as well. So I would use lots of her little techniques. What it made me do was just really find myself in the moment, but in the moment over and over and over again. So I know it's a bit of a cliche to talk about being in the moment, and meditation and things like that had never worked for me. But suddenly I found that I was able to completely switch off, even switch off from thinking, right, I've got to get there, before it's dark, or I've got to get there, I've got to get there before my boots start leaking, whatever it is. I was like, no, I'm going to really take this slowly, and I'm actually going to lie in the heather and have a little sleep, because she's very keen on lying in the heather and having a little sleep. So she's fantastic for making you rethink how you walk. So she really, so she was great. But the one actually that really resonated was Simone de Beauvoir, because she, like me, had lost all sort of faith in her body, because when she got to school, she was always the last one to be picked for teams. She was very, very clever, and she was pigeonholed, as women are. She was the clever one. So she wasn't allowed to be clever and sporty. So because she was a clever one, no one ever wanted her in any of their teams. And she ended up feeling that, her body had betrayed her, and her body was not a thing of strength. So she found her physical strength, if you like, her sense of her body through walking, because she, like me, could walk. And she loved walking. And then from walking, she learned to cycle, she learned to swim, she learned to ski. But walking was her way in, and she was incredibly adventurous and quite a real risk taker. But walking was her routine. And I think walking is available to all of us. So I love that. I love the fact that anyone who didn't grow up, horse riding and fencing and swimming and whatever, anyone who didn't have those opportunities, we can all walk. So walking is just one way to get back into a more adventurous and physical way of being. And again, she writes about how that walking. So she starts like all of us, or like many of us, she starts by just walking to school when she's a child, and then she starts going a bit further afield. And by the time she's in her 20s, she's going off for 3 weeks across the Dolomites and through the Pyrenees on her own, sleeping rough. She sleeps out on benches, and she sleeps out in barns. And from there, she goes to downhill skiing and cycling and very reckless driving. And she just learns to be she learns to be comfortable with that level of risk and danger, really. In fact, and then she discovers she really quite likes it. She's really quite, she really quite likes being in dangerous situations. So I love that. I love the idea that walking can take you literally and metaphorically anywhere you want.
That's so interesting. I love that you picked Simone de Beauvoir as well, because I studied her at university. I remember, and I can't remember many of the people I studied at university because I was mainly skiing and snowboarding and stuff. And my degree sort of took a secondary moment in my 4 years. But the one person I do remember studying is Simone de Beauvoir, and I remember just reading, her books and and for me, it was so revealing and so, in many ways, life-changing, that opening up to actually what's I guess the period in which she was writing, and that sort of the way in which she wrote about, particularly around feminism. But I was just thinking, actually, that sort of that empowerment that comes with physical empowerment as well, and how feeling that you're able to take risks in one area can also translate into feeling you're capable of taking risks into others. So how potentially, I guess, that the walking and then her philosophy became so, enmeshed with each other. I just think that's...
In fact, and she does talk about that. She said, if all girls grew up believing and being taught to fly or being taught to fight. I mean, she talks about fighting on stage. It's quite bizarre. She said, if girls could get in and fight with each other, we would all feel more comfortable with danger and with risk and just with it being in our bodies.
Yes.
And what it's like to have muscles or to be scratched, because she had such a cerebral childhood as a devout Catholic and this very clever, brainy Catholic, that it was a revelation to her that, life, that dangers is quite important to have a little bit of, and to be able to feel that you can take a risk, not always to be sort of living on the sidelines.
Definitely.
And most people don't talk about Simone de Beauvoir in that way. They talk about they might talk about her feminism, or they might talk about her philosophy, but actually, and that's so there's something so very grounding about that side of her. I thought that, she just, packed up her bag and off she went.
Definitely. And that sense of, almost making this into a whole person who, like you said, has other interests and other aspects, and that all of those different parts of your life feed into each other, and that you're permitted, at a time that, and even like you say, nowadays, that this idea that we're sort of pigeonholed, or, you're this person, or you're the brainy one, or you're the, the sporty one, or whatever, that you can, like you said, that sort of sense of embodiment, and the fact that in a way, both those examples are sort of embodiment in different ways as well, that reconnecting women with their physical selves as much as that space. I was just wondering, in terms of the sort of the benefits that walking has brought you, that there's I don't want to call them obvious benefits, because much as we talk about them, they're not always that obvious, but the sort of the physical benefits and the being out in the open air and all that sort of thing. I guess, what else has walking brought you that, or even, writing this book has brought you in a way that you hadn't necessarily expected?
It's been a very good exercise in overcoming the fear that I was talking about, that had just been, lingering and not going away, even though I'd look at my children and think, well, they're older now. Why am I still feeling anxious about walking along a cliff edge or whatever it was, walking out in the dark? So one of my big revelations was walking out at night, which I'd always wanted to do. I was always reading about these men who would go off these wonderful moonlit walks. And, occasionally I'd say to a girlfriend, do you want to go for a moonlit walk? And they were like, oh, God, I don't think so, or they were busy or whatever, no one seemed very keen on it. But I was desperate to go out at night for a walk in the countryside. And so that was one of the things I started doing, because all of these women, in fact, many of the other 50, they are all going out at night for walks. And first of all, I thought, oh, that's really odd. They're all just going out for night walks. But then I thought, they had no television. There was no Netflix. There was, going back, there was not even electric light overhead. So what would they do in their evenings? It seemed, and then I thought about it, I thought, oh, very sensible, go for a walk. But to us now, it seems quite odd, doesn't it, to go for a walk on your own, in the dark. People would think you're a little bit weird, and we're also very scared. And none of these women were scared of that. I thought, well, things can't be any more dangerous now. In fact, probably less dangerous. We have phones and we have street lighting, and it just seemed to me less dangerous. I suspect that the news, we are privy to so much information now. So if we hear about a really vicious attack on a woman at night, we all know about it very, very quickly. Then these things didn't make it into the papers. So those women, I suspect, just didn't know. So they lived, this is my theory, my hunch anyway, they lived in a sort of blissful ignorance that we don't have. We are just loaded down with horrific stories, aren't we? And these images, I spoke to a psychologist friend, and she said these images they sear themselves into your brain. So they're really hard to shift. So I thought, well, I'm going to shift them. And I sort of taught myself bit by bit to go for this walk. I went through the same wood. And in fact, what I realized is if you're in an area that you know quite well, and there's nobody there, you never see anyone. After a while, you start to feel comfortable with the dark and with the noises and the rustlings in the tree and the things, the creatures rustling in the hedgerow. So it's still feel, but now I also think, okay, it's probably just a badger or a rabbit or a fox, or it's the wind, because I've never seen anybody here. I've got a little special wood. I've never seen anybody there. So I just sort of made myself do it. And I used to do it at a little bit of a later time. I talk about it in the book, actually, a little bit of a later time each evening. So it started when it was light, then I did it when it was slightly dark, and then a bit darker, and then within about, I don't think it was about 3 or 4 weeks, I was just walking through this rather beautiful 2-mile walk, really, in the dark. And I would never have been able to do that before. And I have to say, I thanked all the women that I had discovered and written about, because they just wrote about it and did it quite nonchalantly. They just said, I'd another night walk. They were all just going out. These little, Nan Shepherd called them her night prowls. And she would get up and go out into the mountains on a night prowl. So I have discovered the moon. I've sort of rebuilt my relationship with dark skies and with stars, and I absolutely love it. So that is one thing that, but you have to be a bit careful talking about it, because I don't want everyone rushing out. You still have to pay attention to your personal safety, and that's sad, but it is the way it is.
Yeah, and like you said, you've done it in a way that allowed you to be in a space where you were comfortable, you knew where you were able to, I suppose, build those steps in. Because I can imagine there's probably people listening to this, and certainly, when I read it in the book, I was like, oh my goodness, yeah, that's still something that even early in the morning I'm uncomfortable with. But there are also, like you say, places where that will feel much more threatening than maybe others.
In fact, cities are more threatening. Cities, most of these horrific crimes, they take place in cities. So I wouldn't walk around. I wouldn't, live in London, but I wouldn't walk, mostly in London, but I wouldn't walk around London or any of the parks around London after dark. And that really makes me very angry.
No, absolutely. This is it, at the level of going, that on the one hand, it's that we know about it, but also that we're still in this situation. Hundreds of years later, still in the situation. I know. So I guess I'm slightly hesitant to ask this question, because one, I don't think it's terribly polite to ask a writer what's coming next, in case you're going, no, this is a secret project, or I'm squirreling away with it. But also I guess I'm really interested, because this has obviously been a real, whilst, incredibly well written and researched, a real passion for you as well, in terms of how, the work that you've done on this book. And I was just thinking, do you have a next step you think, actually, I've uncovered a lot more stories that I'd like to share, or actually, that's, I'm happy with what I've done with that in terms of starting this process. Hopefully it will, elevate this type of adventure writing that, like you said, that just doesn't get talked about, or gets talked about in quite a sort of a goal-oriented way, rather than a process way or a mindful way. Or just in terms of personally, whether you think, actually, no, there's a walk I'd really like to go on now as a result of discovering all of this.
Oh God, so many walks I want to go on, and lockdown's just been disastrous. Because
I know.
Finishing writing it in lockdown, and I was just dying to go for a walk, and I was just still walking around the same old park. But we all were, so it didn't feel so bad. there was no FOMO, was there? We were all just
we're all in the same, on the same routes round.
Yes. But I've got another book on walking coming out next year, next March, which is about it's called 52 Ways to Walk. It's about different ways of walking. So sort of building on some of it was sort of material that got stripped out of Windswept because it's quite scientific. It's quite sort of research oriented. And it's about what happens to your body when you walk, early in the morning, or when you walk before you've eaten, or when you walk after you've eaten, or when you walk at night, or when you walk barefoot. What happens to the physiology of your feet. So, and it's week by week. So each week has a different walk that works a different part of your anatomy or your brain, or walking meditation. So all sorts of walks in there. And then I'm also, so that's already done. And then I'm currently writing on a book about women who do things at night, because all this night prowling made me, and I don't sleep very well. So my first book I wrote in the night, actually. So all this night prowling, I thought, gosh, there's a lot of women out there doing quite extraordinary things at night. So I'm researching them, and indeed there are a lot of sleepless women out there certainly were doing and still are doing absolutely remarkable things that I don't think they would be doing during the day. So I'm sort of looking at that, because I think night is a sort of different country, really. It feels like it's a whole different world, isn't it? Different terrain.
Totally. I mean, that's such an amazing way, just following on from what you were saying about the walks that you were doing. I was just suddenly thinking about, when I had my first baby, and that thing of, being up at 2 or 3 in the morning, and you sit there and you feel like you are literally the only person in the world awake at that time. And it can either be an incredibly sort of lonely experience, or like you said, there's also other, that once you get into it, actually you start sort of, you almost start reclaiming that space as being
that's exactly what I'm writing about, because it really polarizes people. Some people find it very lonely and feel very frightened and become much more anxious at night, and some people find it quite liberating, because suddenly they've got time and space. Everyone's asleep, and there's no one demanding things, and the phone's not ringing, and there's nothing. So you've got time to yourself. And so for some women, actually often a lot of them are writers and painters, for some women, particularly mothers, that was the only time they had. They would get up at 2 or 3 or 4, and they would paint, or some sing, some cook, some write, some do all sorts of things, some go for walks.
Wow, amazing. I literally can't wait to read that, because I think that would be so fascinating. Like you said, sometimes it is the only time you have. So this is a question I always ask my guests. If somebody reads your book or has been listening to this podcast and thinks, either, wow, the night walking sounds incredible, or I would love to just get started walking in general, or my own adventure, and I just, I'm lacking the confidence, I don't really know where to start. I mean, what's the one piece of advice you'd give them from all the research and the insight that you've got?
A rather dull but very important piece of advice is to have the right kit.
No, super important.
It's just number one,
especially after all the bra and wool socks talk. It's like
exactly. There are amazing companies making amazing equipment. Just invest. I think you've got to see it as an investment, because some of it feels very pricey, doesn't it? The first time you start looking at these.
Yeah, absolutely.
You think, oh my god, it's quite expensive. But I think you can. You can actually. Look, one of the first treks I did, I hired the full everything I needed, the tent, the whatever. So that was quite a good way. But otherwise, if you think you're going to be, but walking boots, most important thing, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think, it's the thing that makes and breaks it in the end, because if you're worried, if you're walking along and you've got blisters or it's uncomfortable, that's what you're thinking about in the end. And
yes, I would actually say,
goes out the window.
Splash out and get the best, most comfortable you can afford. Waterproof trousers, absolutely vital if you're in this country or Scandinavia.
Waterproof everything, yes.
Yeah, waterproofs that work.
Yeah.
Again, and also remember to reproof them. That's quite dull and boring, but it's slightly more quirky, actually. What I would say, and which I learned from the walking women I wrote about, is try taking a tiny little sketchbook and a little tiny, and doesn't matter if you can't draw or paint, don't worry about that. Little pencil, little rubber, and one of those little miniature tins of paint, little miniature. They're very small, and they only have about 6 paints in whatever, but you can get water from a puddle or a pond or anything really. And I've absolutely loved just putting the phone away and trying to see something, to observe it as a painter would, and to sketch it. And they're absolutely terrible, but I don't care about that because no one's going to look at them. But what they do is I found they really pulled me right into the moment, right into where I was. And afterwards, that point was the one that always stuck with me. So, months later when I could, it was all a blur, I always remembered that point where I was drawing or painting. I remember it crystal clear, the whole image is there. So I would urge people to think about trying that, whatever adventure they're on. Actually, it doesn't have to be walking. If you're on an adventure and you're going to have even just 1 minute where you can be still enough to have a quick draw, have a go.
That's amazing. I think that's one of my favorite pieces of advice so far. Actually, I've never, and only because I know, I just think that's, as you were talking about it before, about how they wouldn't have had cameras and, these women sort of walking around and taking paint. And I just thought, gosh, it's something that in a way you lose, don't you? Because of technology, that actually there's much you gain in terms of maybe feeling safe and connected and all those aspects. But then there is an aspect of loss in terms of, like you said, that real, you can take hundreds and hundreds of photos, but you could probably do 1 or 2 sketches, in a walk, if that. So that's amazing. I'm going to try that literally.
Just try it. And the thing you've got to do is just not think, I can't do this and I'm no good at drawing. It's sort of irrelevant, really. It's not about the product at the end. It's about the process and the experience. Try it and see what you think. But I absolutely love it.
Wonderful. So if people want to find out more about you, want to read the book, where can they go?
Oh, well, the book is available anywhere, Amazon or any bookshop, any independent bookshop, any bookshop at all. Actually, you can just go and order it, and it's probably in libraries. So that's very easy to get hold of. And I have a website, which is www.annabelabs.com. And I'm on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, the usual places. And in fact, what I do on those is that every week I post a walking woman that didn't get into the book.
Oh, wow.
Every week I put up a woman who no one knows was a walker or no one's ever heard of. And I just do a couple of lines about why or how they walked. So the woman last week actually was a very famous cookery writer. And when her sister died, which I think was 1937, something about that, her sister died in the Alps. She was just going for a walk.
Oh, gosh.
And she slipped and fell, and she went just tumbling down all these slopes into a ravine, and she died. I mean, absolutely tragic. So the cookery writer had 2 young children, and she was really sort of devastated by this very sudden, tragic death of her sister she was very close to. And she couldn't come to terms with it at all. So eventually she left her 2 children with her mother, and she took the train over to the Alps, and she did this really long hike all the way over the Swiss Alps down and right down into Italy. And that was how she, I think, sort of made peace with what had happened to her sister. And then she came back and she was able to sort of move on with her life, I should say. So every week I have someone like that, and I just put a couple of lines about why they walked, what prompted them to do something so risky, really.
No, absolutely. Gosh, incredible. Yeah, no, well, I'm definitely going to go and check those out as well. That's amazing. And I'll pop all of the links and everything into the show notes as well, so people can find that quickly. And obviously, keep tabs on when your next books are coming out too, because they sound wonderful. Annabel, thank you so much. That's been absolutely incredible. I wish we had another hour to keep chatting. There's so much I want to ask you, but no, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
So I want to extend an enormous thank you to Annabel for agreeing to come and talk to me. It was such a pleasure speaking to her. And you probably noticed that episode went on slightly longer than usual. But I found the discussion around women's place in terms of women walking and how we occupy those outdoor spaces really fascinating. And I think she raises a lot of issues that are incredibly timely at the moment, tragically, around how we feel safe, how we are safe in places that are outside the home, whether that is just going about our daily business or whether it is about, going out on adventures and feeling that it is both physically and psychologically safe for us to undertake these adventures. And then I think a lot of the barriers to why people don't take on adventures or step out their comfort zones can be very much about how safe we feel in doing this. I think the value in tracing this back through history just shows that this is not a challenge that is just faced now, that this is a timeless challenge. This has been faced by generations and centuries of women who want to undertake these challenges and these adventures and embrace the richness and the fullness of life, and that sadly that's not always possible, or sadly that these factors do impinge on our ability or our sense of safety in doing that. And I think it's really important to recognize how we go about changing that is not, and I've seen plenty of advice posts over the last week and 2 weeks about this is what you should do if, a policeman approaches you, or a man approaches you, or a person approaches you, or, this is what you should ask for. And the responsibility that gets shoved on women to somehow put themselves in the right place. And yes, absolutely, that I think we've all been aware of when we felt more vulnerable and less vulnerable in these situations, but at the same time, actually the responsibility, the implication that somehow just by being a woman outside, it is your responsibility, and as an extension of that, your fault if something goes wrong, if something happens to you. It makes me absolutely raging, if I am honest. And I know I tend to keep this podcast relatively light, but there are subjects there I feel that actually expressing that anger, that we are still having these conversations, that women are still in these situations nowadays, and that the responsibility for that is still placed firmly at the feet of women, I find shocking. And I think going back to Annabel's points that she makes, that that this is not something that has just appeared out of nowhere, and that unless we have a sense of how women have experienced walking and being out in outdoor spaces throughout history, it is very difficult for us as a culture and a society, and for the messages we send to both women and to men and to children around what is okay and what is not okay is still very mixed. So partly this is saying, I know a lot of this podcast is around how we can take individual ownership and control in terms of building our resilience and getting outside, but it is also a recognition that there are cultural and social aspects and challenges that we face, and that actually collectively sometimes we have, that it's a recognition that that is wrong, and that pressure on us as individuals needs to shift to a societal change. Anyway, that is where I'm going to leave it for this week. You can agree, you can disagree with me. I'm absolutely happy to be challenged on this. I might not agree with you, but I'm happy to be challenged. And I really hope that this episode has given you something to think about and, to reflect on. It has been a very difficult few months when it comes to women's safety in the outdoors. And I can't think of a more prescient time for Annabel to be doing the work that she is doing, and to raising that level of consciousness too. On that note, I'm going to leave you for this week. If any of these topics has had resonance for you, if you want to reach out, you want to raise this, if you've got any points to make, your feedback's always welcome. You can find me on Instagram, Resilience at Work. You can find me on Facebook in the Everyday Adventure Club. You can contact me via my website, resiliencework.co.uk. I'm also on Twitter occasionally, so you can get in touch with me there, resilience_works. Otherwise, I will be back again next week with another wonderful guest for you to share their story and their journey with. And I cannot wait to speak to you then. Take care. Bye.